Hi, I'm Anthony Filari from Bayou Mountain Farms, and this video is about how to make a high-quality bone broth. Now, bone broth has been used as a folk remedy to cure just about anything in the past. Lately, there's been a renewed interest in bone broth because of the incredibly dense nutritional profile it offers and the amazing healing results people have been experiencing using it. Now, you can make bone broth out of anything with bones, fish, fowl, or mammal. Today, we're going to be specifically using chicken as a base for our bone broth. Now, to make a high-quality bone broth, there's really two criteria. Number one, you have to have high-quality ingredients, which we'll be talking about in a moment. And number two, you need a good processing method. I say that because you can't just cook bone broth for a couple of hours. It takes a long time period to extract all the nutrients and get everything out of the chicken stock that we're going to be using. Typically, bone broths are cooked for about a 24 to 48 hour period. The bone broth we'll be making today, we cook for 48 hours. And that takes 3 days. For example, on day one, let's say we start at 1 o'clock. On day two at 1 o'clock is a 24-hour period. Day three at 1 o'clock is a 48-hour period. So we cook the bone broth for 48 hours over a 3-day period. Now, that being the case, it makes a lot of sense to make a big batch of bone broth because it takes you the same amount of time whether you make a quart or 5 gallons. I generally make about 4.5 to 5 gallons of bone broth when I make it. I have a 20-quart stock pot that I use. And I save up the chicken parts, I put them in the freezer, and when I have a sufficient amount, I make the bone broth. And speaking of a stock pot, let me mention that to you. The type of pot you use is kind of important. I would not suggest you use anything that contains aluminum. Ideally, you want to have either an enamel pot, or what I prefer is a stainless steel pot with an aluminum bottom. The aluminum's on the outside. It's not touching anything inside the pot. What that does is it gives you a heat sink, and it makes sure that the flame, if you're using a flame, is evenly distributed and you get a nice uniform temperature. There's no hot spots, because if you get a hot spot, you're overcooking some areas where the rest of the broth is really not heated to the same temperature. So a stainless steel pot with a heavy bottom is ideal. You have to think about the stock pot that you're using as a digestive chamber, because when we're using the chicken that we're going to be using, we're using the whole chicken, or as much of the chicken as possible. Parts that you don't normally eat. You don't eat the bones of a chicken. You discard them. But animals eat them because there's a lot of nutrition contained within the bones. So what we're doing in our pot is this is acting as our stomach. And we're putting ingredients in, which I'll talk about shortly, that are helping to break down and digest the chicken parts. So we're extracting as much nutrients out of the chicken stock as possible and into the broth so we can more readily absorb and assimilate it. So I said the ingredients are very important. Let's talk about the ingredients. We raise our own chickens here. In fact, we breed, hatch, and raise them from our own chickens. Our chickens are free range. They're fed only an organic diet. And since they're free ranging, they're out there hunting and scratching and exercising. They're picking out bugs. They're eating grasses. So they have a well-balanced diet and they're very healthy. You want the healthiest chicken you can get, because think about it. If you're getting chicken bought from the store that's living in a confined environment where there's more waste that they're surrounded by, they're not out in the nature where things can break down naturally. They may be fed GMOs or diets that have a lot of waste product or even toxic residue in some of the stock that they feed chickens. They may be fed antibiotics. They may be fed hormones. All of these things accumulate in the chicken. And the chickens are basically, if they're caged in, they're not roaming around. They're not that healthy. So if you're starting with an unhealthy chicken that has accumulated toxins, you're concentrating those toxins in your soup, because the soup is basically chicken broth that we're making concentrates the nutrition. Well, if there's any toxicity in there, it's also concentrating the toxicity. So you want a natural chicken as possible. Additionally, we use as much of the chicken as possible. We use the whole chicken. Since we process our own chickens, we have everything at our disposal there. The only thing that's not in the bone broth that we're using is the feathers, the blood, because that's how we bleed it out when we process them, and some of the intestines. We use a lot of the internal organs. Now, some of the parts we use may seem unsavory to some people because we use the head and the feet and a lot of the internal organs. And you have to keep in mind, every part of the chicken stores a different enzyme, vitamin, and mineral. So if you use the whole chicken, you're more assured of getting a broad array of vitamins and minerals and enzymes. Whereas if you only eat the meat and skin, which most people use when they consume chicken, you're missing out on all that other nutrition. Every part of the chicken stores these different nutrients, so we don't want to miss out on that. So we put it all in there. Now, if you're uncomfortable using a chicken head or don't have access to a chicken head or the chicken feet, that's fine. You don't have to put them in, but it does give you a much higher quality bone broth. So let's talk about the other ingredients. Another important ingredient is the water you use. You want the water to be as pure and clean, as natural as possible. I would not suggest using city water. City water is usually has chlorine or chloramine in it, fluoride, and a whole host of other stuff. You don't know what's in that water, and a lot of times that water is coming from treatment plants which can have a lot of residue in it that you may not know about. It's best to get spring water if possible. If worst case, if you can't get your own natural spring water, some bottled water should be okay. Distilled water is also fine. The mineral content of the water is not that important as long as it's normal, natural, healthy minerals in the water. You don't want foreign substances in the water. Next, what we do, we add to the water some ingredients. We add some now and we add some later. Right? The first go around right now is we're only going to add three ingredients. One is an apple cider vinegar. We use apple cider vinegar, as I mentioned before, this is our digestive chamber. And just as our stomach has hydrochloric acid, we're going to be using acetic acid, vinegar, inside our bone broth to extract nutrients out of the bones and cartilage and tissue in there. I remember as a kid, we used to take chicken bones and soak them in vinegar. And after about a week or so, you could take the bones out and you could actually bend the bones. The acetic acid will leach out a lot of the calcium, forms a calcium acetate. It also leaches out a lot of the phosphorus and magnesium out of the bone and literally turns it to rubber. We're going to be using it to digest the bones and cartilage to a higher degree to extract more nutrients out so our bone broth has more dense nutritional profile. Also, we use some sea salt. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Yes, it does add some flavor. This is sea salt that is naturally evaporated, so it has the full spectrum of minerals that the sea has. Seawater has about 80 to 90 different micronutrients in it. We want to put that in there. Bone broth was traditionally used, and people that had great success with it follow traditional formulas, and those formulas had salt in it. I believe the salt acts in this way. When we're extracting out all these ionic and colloidal minerals out of the chicken, they're floating around there. If you put extra minerals in there, and the sea salt has 80 to 90 minerals, you put those minerals in there, it can form more complex nutritional compounds. Sometimes the chicken stock may be missing some of the vitamins and some of the nutrients that are in the sea salt, and allows more complex formations to take place. So the salt also acts as an extractant agent to a certain extent and helps break down the tissue a little bit more. So salt is one of the additives we use. And lastly, we use an herb mix. This herb mix is from our garden. Every year we process our herbs. We take all the herbs that we have and we take a little bit of each. We bottle them separately and we take a handful of each. We put them into a big batch and we form what we call our herbal mix. And we use this to sprinkle on soups and foods and salads. We also use it for cooking. So there's about 12 different herbs in here. The particular herbs aren't all that important. The reason we use some herbs in the beginning, we also use them at the end. The reason we use them in the beginning is the same reason as the sea salt. We want to put those herbs in there because there's a lot of micro and phytonutrients in the herbs that can form more complex nutritional compounds as we're extracting the minerals and vitamins and enzymes out of the chicken. So that's it. Those are the ingredients we use initially. Later on, we'll add some more ingredients later this afternoon, as I'll show you. But that's it. I'm going to reposition the camera and we'll put all this together into the stock pot and we'll turn the heat up and we'll get this chicken bone broth brewing. So let me reposition and I'll be right back. Okay, so let's assemble our ingredients. In this pot, I have about 1.5 gallons of water. How much water you'll actually use will vary a little bit. If your chicken parts are cut up very small, you can use less water. You don't want to use too much water. If you do, you'll dilute your bone broth down a little bit, and you may find it doesn't congeal. Usually a good bone broth, when you put it in the refrigerator, will congeal. All the gelatin and collagen in there will actually make almost like a jello-like bone broth, and as soon as you heat it up, it liquefies again. But that's a good sign that you did a good job. If you use too much water, you won't get that. It doesn't mean it's a bad product. The nutrients are still in there. They're just going to be consuming a little bit more of it because it's watered down. So you want just enough water to cover your chicken parts is ideal. Now what some people do is they start with more water and they reduce it down by leaving the lid off. I don't believe that's a good idea. I like keeping the lid on the entire process. The reason being, if I'm smelling any of the herbs or chicken stock in the air, although it may smell nice in the kitchen, I'm losing some kind of volatile component because I'm smelling it. It's in the air. If I leave the lid on, I'm recycling more of the nutrients and more of those volatiles, so more of the nutrients stay in my chicken, my bone broth, and that's really what I'm aiming for. So I have about 1.5 gallons of water. After I put the chicken parts in, I may want to add a little bit more water, but I think that should be approximately right. Let's add our ingredients. We're going to add to this, for 2 chickens, we're going to add 1/4 cup of vinegar, apple cider vinegar. This is a naturally fermented apple cider vinegar. We're going to add 1 tablespoon of sea salt. Again, this is a natural sea salt that has the full spectrum of all the minerals from the ocean. And sea salt's a lot sweeter than regular salt. It actually has a sweetness to it. And the sodium content is lower than regular table salt. So I just thought I'd mention that. And we put 1 tablespoon of our herb mix. Next, for the chicken parts. Now, I told you I was using 2 chickens, 2 full chickens. It's mostly 2 full chickens. One of the chickens we decided to have the meat, the breast and the thighs last night. So we ate those, but we saved the bones. Remember, this is a bone broth. You don't need to put meat in here. You could literally just save all the bones from chickens that you eat, put them in the freezer, and save them along with chicken feet if you have it, chicken heads, any of the chicken parts that you don't normally consume, and get a whole freezer box filled with all those chicken parts. And when you get enough, you can make a bone broth. I like to include some of the fresh meat in my bone broth. As you'll see, we're going to cook this for a little bit, remove that meat and put it to the side. And we're going to use that to do some other things that I'll mention when the time comes. Or we could actually add that back to the stock after it's fully cooked. You don't want to cook meat for 48 hours. It'll just disintegrate into nothing. So we're going to use a combination of both bones and fresh chicken. So let's add our chicken. This is the full chicken that we processed a couple days ago with the neck. Everything's here. We're going to place that in our bone broth solution. We're also going to place 2 chickens, so we have 4 feet. We'll place the 4 feet in. We're going to place the 2 chicken heads. We're going to place the gizzard. I usually put the liver and the hearts in a separate container. I'm going to jump all of those in. When we process the birds, we usually cut the wing tips off. So I have the 4 wing tips that I'll drop in. And I have part of the other chicken. This is the neck and some of the skin, the tail, and the backbone of the chicken that we ate last night. We cut the little wing tips off, not the wing tips, the arms off. And here's the remaining bones from what we ate last night. Here's the breastbone, and here's 2 of the thigh bones. Now the thigh bones were roasted. We grilled these on the grill, so they were done at a higher temperature. A bone broth is only going to go to about 212 degrees because that's the point of boiling water. So the bone broth will never go over that temperature. A lot of people suggest that you roast the bones, and you can. It gives it a caramelized, richer, darker flavor to the bone broth. So I don't mind putting some of the bones in, but I don't like roasting everything. Because when you're roasting them, whether you're frying them or cooking them in the oven, you're cooking 350 degrees or more, which is denaturing more of the proteins and changing the molecular structure a little bit of what you're cooking. I rather not have it go over 212 degrees. More of the enzymes will remain intact, and you're not denaturing the proteins as much. So although some of it tastes good, so I don't mind putting a few of the roasted bones in there. That's basically it. Those are my ingredients for now. What I'm going to do is put the lid on. I'm going to put this on the back burner because it's going to be here for 48 hours. And I'm going to turn the heat up high. I'm going to bring the heat all the way up until I get a full boil. As soon as it's boiling, I turn it down as low as I can to maintain a simmer. I want a very low simmer. When you take the lid off, you should see some steam coming out. and just a couple of little bubbles coming out. Very low simmer, because it's going to be like that for the next 48 hours, or actually for the next period of time. But what we're going to do, because we had meat in there, we're going to take that meat out in about 2.5 hours. In 2.5 hours, that meat will be fully cooked. We extracted some of the nutrients out, and we're going to remove that meat. We'll put that to the side. We're going to process the bones a little bit, as I'll show you. We're going to add a few more ingredients, and then the rest of, that's all the hard work is done. The rest is just sitting back and a lot of waiting. So we'll check back with you in about 2.5 hours, and I'll show you the next process from there. It's been approximately 2 hours. I recently checked the bone broth, and what I was looking for is to see if the meat is pulling away from the bones. You can see it's at a light simmer, just steam coming off. You'll see a couple of bubbles come up here and there. What I was looking for is to see if the bones are separating nicely from the meat, which they are. So this is a good time. I'm going to reposition the camera and show you what we do from here. At this point, I'm going to turn the heat off on the stove, and I'm going to take the contents of the pot and pour it through the strainer. Basically, what I want to do is separate the broth that we have so far from the chicken parts. I'm going to hand sort through the chicken parts, and that's why I have the gloves on. Gloves make things a little bit more sanitary, and these are partially insulated, so I can work in the hot broth and the hot chicken parts without getting burned. What I want to do is separate the meat from the bones that are in the broth. I'm going to put the meat to the side. The meat cooked for about 2 hours, so it's ready to eat, and I don't want to leave it in the broth because it'll just totally disintegrate. I'm taking it out and removing it now. Some of the nutrients were removed from it. What I'm going to do with the meat is put it into a container and put it in the refrigerator. I'm going to use that to make either chicken salad or a piece of chopped up chicken that I can season and put in a salad, or use it for sandwich meat. The rest of the parts are going to go back into the broth. We're going to process them. I'll show you what we do to process them. We're going to add a few more ingredients, and then we're going to put it back on the stove. So let's get started. When you're pouring something hot, you definitely don't want to stand over it. You want to stand back or off to the side, because you're going to be a lot of steam coming up when you pour this off. So let me get the bone broth. I'm going to first hand pick out some of the larger parts, so when I'm pouring this off, it's not splashing around. And if you saw, the meat is separating, the bones are separating pretty nicely from the carcass. So this is going to be a real easy job. Once I get going here, you can see how everything's just falling apart. I'm going to remove the chickens that are in here, the big parts of the chicken. And the rest I'm just going to pour through. And I'll dump the remaining parts right in that strainer. At this point, my main interest is really just taking the meat off the bones. So I don't want the skin. I want the skins and bones to remain in the broth. I just want the meat. So for example, here's one of the thighs. This is a back part. I don't need that. I'm going to pull the skin off that's on here. It just falls right off. I'm going to remove the meat that's on the bones. There's a little bit more skin. I'm going to put that back into our stew pot. I'm removing the loose meat that's on here. And I'm going to put the bones in a pile. So I'm going to have two piles here. I'm going to have the meat section, all the meat that I remove on the one plate, all the bones on the other, and any smaller parts, smaller bones and skin and other tissue, connective tissue, and the legs and all, I'm going to put back into the stew pot. So this might take a few minutes. I might fast forward most of this. It's really pretty straightforward. This is just the necks and the carcass from the chicken that we mostly ate, so there's nothing to really remove from that. The chicken feet we're going to put back in here. Here's some of the bones that I had before. I'm just going to put those on the plate. I'm just going to go through this, and actually I'm almost done already. Here's the chicken breasts. I'm removing the skin, placing the skin back in the stew pot. Here's the chicken breasts. I'm going to put that into our plate. Remove the wishbone. There's another thigh here. I'm going to remove the skin, just like the other side. Remove the meat. There's a couple more pieces of meat here, and the rest are just the legs, the heads, the wing tips, and some of the gizzards and internal organs. I'm going to take the internal organs out, the gizzard, the other gizzard. Here's some of the liver, another liver, the hearts, and one more heart. And the rest of the material I'm going to dump back into our stew pot. This meat I'm going to pick through a little bit more, clean it up. If there's anything that I don't want, I'm going to put back into the stew pot. Make sure there's no skin. If there's any connective tissue or tendons, especially in the legs, there's a lot more tendons there. I'm going to remove those. Let this cool, and I'm going to put this in the refrigerator, like I said, to use later on. So this is kind of done. What I want to show you is what I do with the longer bones. I want to process them down a little bit more. I can put them in, keep them whole like this, and they will extract quite a bit. But if I could break the bones up, I'll be able to remove more nutrients from it. So I have just this little piece of wood here. It's a little angle. It makes it a little bit easier. And just a little mallet. What I'm going to do is just crush the end of the bone. Crack it to open it up a little bit so the marrow's exposed. And I'm going to put those pieces of bone back into my bone broth, broken up. So I put these smashed pieces of bone back in. I'll do one more and then I'll probably fast forward this. Okay, at that point we have all the bones smashed down. What we're going to do is pour our broth back into this bone mix. I like to take some of these other pieces and just break them up a little bit. You'll see they'll be kind of soft, still a little crunchy. That will definitely soften up and dissolve more as we go along. But I want to make sure everything's broken down a little bit. For example, here's one of the feet. You'll see that the skin and bones are starting to disintegrate on that and it's falling apart. So I break this up a little bit more to get more exposure. So the extractants, the water, and the vinegar can work better on all of this. Even the head is just literally falling apart. So I smush this up a little bit. And now from here, I'm just going to add back in the broth that we had. You can see the broth has already picked up a little bit of color. It's going to be a lot darker when we finish. And there's a decent amount of fat floating in the broth as it stands. We're extracting a lot of the fat out of the skin and tissue in here. Now we're going to add a few more ingredients. There's no need to process these ingredients or chop them up fine. In fact, I put them in whole. We're going to be putting some vegetables in. The reason we're putting them in now, if you put them in the beginning, they just get in the way of doing what we just did. So we're going to put in a few vegetables that add, again, more nutrients to the mix and more flavor. So we're going to add, I have here about 5 carrots, just whole. I just cut the ends off and washed them, scrubbed them down. And remember, we're cooking this for 48 hours. We only cooked it for 2 hours so far. These vegetables will pretty much disintegrate. There'll be nothing left when we're done, and we're going to be extracting a lot of the nutrients out. So this bone broth is going to be jam-packed with vitamins and minerals. I have about 4 stems of celery. I might just crack them so they fit in break them in half so they fit a little bit better in the pot. I'm going to put 3 whole onions in. These are white onions. If you put yellow onions in, it tends to give you a little bit darker bone broth, which is kind of nice. I like to see the color come from the bone itself and not so much from vegetables that I put in. I put a couple of pieces of kelp seaweed in. Again, there's a lot of enzymes and a lot of minerals in seaweed. And I put about 5 or 6 cloves of garlic. Now I also put another 1/4 cup of vinegar in. So vinegar boils at a higher temperature than water. So the vinegar we put in there before, we lost very little, but we're putting in even a little bit more. What that does is gives us a a higher acid content that can really get into those bones. And now that we removed a lot of the other tissue in there and just have mostly bones and cartilage, that vinegar is really going to get in there and do a higher extraction, especially since the bones are opened up. That's the hardest part of making bone broth. Now we're going to put this back on the heat. We're going to have to adjust the heat a little bit, get it back to that nice slow simmer, and we're just going to let it cook. Now, I mentioned to you that we cook it for 48 hours, and we do. But what I do at nighttime is I shut the heat off. It's still cooking because when I shut it off, it's when I go to bed, which may be 10, 11 o'clock. And I'm an early riser, so I get up really early. When I get up, I turn the heat back on, I bring it to a boil, and then I turn it down to a nice slow simmer. The reason I like to do that is too, I have a propane here that I'm using, so there's an actual flame, so it's a little bit safer knowing at night that there's no actual flame on. But more importantly, you get a heat cycle and a cold cycle or cooling off cycle. And this thermal expansion and contraction opens up the pores of the chicken and the bones a little bit and gets a higher extraction rate. If you just held the same temperature, it kind of stabilizes. By having these hot and cold periods fluctuating like that, it allows a better expansion and contraction of the pores and allows more nutrients to be removed. So I'm going to turn it off at night. I'm not going to go back on the video and show you me turning it on and off. There's not much to see. But what I will do is tomorrow at 1 o'clock, which would be about 24 hours, we'll take a look at the bone broth and see how it's doing. So that's it for now. I'm going to put this back on the stove, put the lid back on, turn it on, bring it to a boil, slow simmer, and just let that sit until tomorrow sometime. If you like, occasionally you can come in, open up the pot, and just give it a little bit of a stir. It's really not necessary if it keeps it at a nice low simmer. And we already broke everything up, so everything's pretty much homogenized in there. So that's it. I'll check back with you tomorrow at about 1 o'clock, and we'll see how the bone broth is doing. Just checking in on the bone broth. This is day 2. Last night before I went to bed, I turned the heat off. This morning I got up rather early. I got up about 5 o'clock. I turned the heat back on and brought it up to a nice slow simmer. Remember, you don't want to keep this at a rapid boil. You want it a very slow, gentle simmer. When you remove the lid, you should see a decent amount of steam come up. Hopefully that came out on the camera. And we'll take a closer look, and you can see how it's barely boiling. You'll just see some bubbles coming up. It's been approximately 24 hours since we first turned on the heat. So things are digesting nicely. There's a nice coat of oil on the top, a nice slow simmer. And let's take a little bit closer look. Okay, you can see here the steam coming up and bubbles barely coming out. This is the kind of simmer I'm referring to. What I do at this point, just give it a little bit of a stir. Some of these vegetables will start breaking up a little bit. And that's pretty much it. Now, some people suggest that if anything floats to the top, they call it scum. Any scum floats to the top, that you scoop it out. I disagree. I don't think that's scum. If you use fresh, clean ingredients, very little will float to the top, as you can see here. The only thing on the top that's floating here is most of the oils and some of the herbs that I put in there. We got a nice thick coat of oil because the chickens were pretty healthy and had some good fat on them. We extracted some of that. What people call scum, I believe, are just minerals. I would leave the minerals in there, let them recombine, let them digest. Remember, everything in this pot is edible, and especially since we're digesting it and breaking it down into easier to assimilate portions and particles. So just leave everything in there. At the end, we will be straining out everything. So I won't worry about it. Just leave everything in there. Just give it a gentle stir. I'm going to put the lid back on. Tonight, again, I'll be turning the heat off. Tomorrow morning, I'll be turning the heat on, which would be day 3, and then we'll pick up from there. Just checking in on the bone broth. This is day 3. We're in the home stretch now. Just like the previous day, last night, I turned the heat off. This morning, about a little after 5 o'clock this morning, I turned the heat back on, brought it to a slow simmer, and it's been simmering ever since. We are at the 47th hour mark. 1 more hour and the bone broth is done. I stop here for a reason. At this point, I like to add 1 more tablespoon of the herb mix. Or, if you prefer, you can use some fresh chopped up herbs. The reason I do that is herbs are very fragile, and a long cooking period diminishes their nutritional quality. So at the end, I like to put some fresh herbs or the herb mix in to release whatever nutrients those herbs have into the broth. Now, it's kind of the opposite of bone broth. Bone broth, you need a long cooking period to extract those nutrients out because they're locked in. With herbs, are much more fragile, and a long cooking period can diminish the nutritional quality. We did add them in the beginning, but it was for a different reason. As we were extracting nutrients out of the chicken parts, we wanted to have nutrients available to form more complex nutritional compounds. Once they're formed, they kind of solidify and they're more stable. So hopefully we were able to create that situation and captured those, and now we're going to add a few more. I'm going to reposition the camera, open up the pot, show you what the slow simmer looks like one more time. We'll add the herbs, we'll let it sit for 1 more hour, and then we're going to take the bone broth off the stove, strain it out, bottle it up, and we'll be all done. Okay, here's a close-up of the bone broth. You can see we got a lot of steam coming out and a nice slow simmer. We're just going to give it a little bit of a stir. You can see a lot of this stuff is basically breaking apart and digested, the vegetables and all. When you stir it up, it just falls apart. That's what we're looking for. So at this point, we're just going to add 1 more tablespoon of our herb mix. We're going to mix that in. Put the lid back on. Let the heat build up a little bit with the lid on. As soon as you take the lid off, it lets heat out and the simmer went down. Put the lid back on. It'll come back to a simmer. 1 hour from now, we'll come back and we'll finish off the bone broth. Okay, finally, we're at the 48-hour mark. I took the bone broth off the stove, I placed it in the sink, and I placed cold water in the sink. This cools down the bone broth rapidly. Now, that makes it a lot easier to handle, and since I'm going to be using both glass and plastic containers, if you put a hot liquid in a glass container, even if it's Pyrex, potentially it could break. So you avoid that whole problem. Additionally, you prevent any bacteria from building up because this is going to be at almost room temperature, and we want to get it in the refrigerator or freezer as quick as possible. If you wait till it cools off in the container, potentially bacteria could build up. Now, we didn't have to worry about bacteria building up when we were turning it off at night because the next day we were raising the temperature high enough and holding it for an extended period of time where bacteria wouldn't survive. So we didn't have to worry about it at that point. But right now, it's best to cool it off and get it bottled and in the freezer or refrigerator as soon as possible. One thing I'll mention, when I make a bigger batch, takes a little longer to cool off. I found that works a really good way of cooling it off is I use these plastic containers to freeze bone broth in. And although I like to avoid plastic, it works so good in the freezer. Once you take the lid off, you can pop the whole frozen bone broth off as one big ice cube. And you can drop that right in the bone broth. That way you're cooling it off, but you're not diluting your product. You don't want to put ice in the bone broth because you're adding water and you're basically diluting something that you work so hard to concentrate. Alternatively, you can take a container, put some ice and water in there and drop that in. But since we only have maybe about 2.5 gallons here, it's a small batch. The cold water from the sink cooled this off. In fact, I feel very little heat. It's been in here for about 15 minutes. So we're ready to go. I'm going to take the bone broth, get some of that water drip off, and I'm going to pour it into this pot through this colander and catch all the chicken parts and let the bone broth run right through. So let's do that. And you can see the color is nice and deep. We'll take a look when we put it in the bottles. And everything looks like it digested really well. I use that as my gauge to see how good my bone broth is coming out. I don't want to see a lot of big chunks of things. I want to see everything kind of broken down. And that's what we have here. So I'm going to let this drain. What I usually do at this point is just move things around. Let that juice come through. You can hear it still draining. This will take a few seconds to cut through the colander. I can't distinguish too much of anything in here. I see some bits and bones. I'm just going to let this drain. Once I drain it out, I'm going to smash it down a little bit like this. And just like to show you, I'm going to use my fingers here for a second. Here's a bone. This is one of the bigger bones. Could you see how that just breaks apart? it's digested. In fact, if you wanted to, and I don't suggest you do this, but just to show you, you could actually chew these bones and eat them. They just disintegrate in your mouth. They crumble. We digested the bones and the cartilage and the material in the chicken, so there's very little left here. A lot of things went into solution. We absorbed the minerals, extracted the minerals and vitamins and enzymes out, and put it into the broth. And that's exactly what we're looking to do. Now, while this is draining, I'll mention something to you. We cook this for 48 hours. That's typically enough time to get a very good extraction. I base the extraction on how well the bones have disintegrated. If I come back here, maybe my simmer was extra low, or maybe I got up late and I didn't turn it on the next day in enough time, and maybe things didn't get processed enough. I want to make sure that everything breaks apart and is see these bones? You don't even hear them break. They just crumble apart. You get the pieces just fall off of them. So I want to see it digested well like that. If not, you can cook it longer. 48 hours is not locked in stone. You can cook it more or less. For some people, they don't turn the heat off at night and they leave it on continuously. They may be able to have this done in shorter than 48 hours. Some people may turn it off longer. Some people, maybe their temperature was a little lower and they had to go a little bit longer. All right, this is draining out pretty well. I would spend a little bit more time mashing as much of the juice as I can out of this. But just to save time now, I'm going to stop here. I'll come back and get this a little bit later. And again, there's very little that's distinguishable here. It just looks like a big mush of stuff. I'll take this and we put this in one of our composters. We don't put this on the garden because there's a lot of meat and bones and fats and stuff. So this goes in we have a black soldier fly composter, and that goes in that, and they will disintegrate and digest whatever we didn't pull out. Then we'll finish this off. So that doesn't go in our garden, but that goes into our other composter. Now we'll take our broth, and that is how I screen it. I don't go any more than that. I don't mind the chunks. I don't mind the sediment. I want the fat and sediment in there. A lot of the minerals will precipitate out, and when we finish this, you're going to see, when it all settles down, you'll see some sediment on the bottom, you'll see some fat on the top. Some people like to take the fat off, and they decant the liquid off the sediment. That's all nutrients. You work so hard to get it, don't remove it, just leave it in there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fill 1 half gallon jar, because I'll use this immediately. Might make some soup with this. I'll take some of the meat that we took out earlier, put some other vegetables, and I'll make a little chicken soup out of that. So I'm going to pour that in here first. Make sure this is mixed up a little bit. Let me just give it a swirl. You could see the dark color of this. That'll be for my soup. Now, like I said, we probably have, I don't know what we're going to actually end up with. I don't measure the water. I just use enough water to cover the chicken parts. So I'm guessing we had about 2 gallons, but 2.5 gallons, I think we have a little bit less than that. I'm going to fill some of these containers, which I like to freeze. You have to make sure you leave enough headspace so it doesn't break the container. Make sure it's mixed up. And we have a little bit left over, which I'm probably just going to put in here for now, and I'll probably just drink that as soon as I finish this video. And that's basically it. We have our bone broth. You could see right now as we're sitting here, there's some fat, there's a little bit of sediment on the bottom. If you let this sit a little bit longer, you'll see that. When you put this in the refrigerator, this will more than likely gel up. And you could actually spoon it out with a spoon. That's a great sign. If it doesn't gel, don't worry. It's you probably just used too much water. That's basically it. That's the bone broth. What I'll just do is go over and recap the points again on how the process that we used. Okay, I finished pressing out the rest of the chicken stock that we had. And this is what's left. This is basically 2 whole chickens and all the vegetables and ingredients we had reduced down to this. This will go in our composter, as I mentioned before. I'm used to making bigger batches, and I use a larger stock pot. And the stock pot that I have, the large one, when I fill it up with that much liquid, it's about 2.5 gallons. The pot I used was much smaller, and we didn't get as much liquid as I thought we would have. We ended up with 2, 3, 4, 5, a little over 5 quarts of liquid, but we ended up with an excellent quality product. And I say that because, number one, let me bring it a little bit closer. This is still settling down, but as you can see, there's a decent amount of fat that's accumulating at the top, and you can see the sediment at the bottom, or hopefully you can. So all of this is good stuff. This is what we were looking to do, get all these minerals down here and extract the fats out, and that nice, thick, dark, opaque color of the bone broth shows that there's a lot of minerals in there. So I like to recap. 3-day process. Day 1, you just mix the ingredients together. At about a 2-hour mark, 2.5-hour mark, if you're using fresh chicken, remove the meat and put it to the side. If you're not using fresh chicken, just smash up the bones. But in either case, break the bones up, put it back into the broth, and cook it the rest of the day. At nighttime, turn the heat off. Day 2, turn the heat on in the morning, give it an occasional stir. At nighttime, turn the heat off. Day 3, turn the heat on. At the 47-hour mark, if the bones look like they digested well and they're broken down nicely, add the herbal mixture or some handful of fresh herbs, wait another hour, then strain it off and bottle it. And then the last thing to do is just enjoy it. Oh, delicious. Well, listen, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Check out some of our other videos, or better yet, subscribe to our channel so you can see what else we're doing. But for now, that's all. I'm Anthony Filari from Bayou Mountain Farms, and thanks for watching.